weighs around 1.5 kilos. It's roughly the size of a small melon. It has the texture of tofu. Our so-called grey matter is in fact pinkish grey in colour. It's made up of 100 billion nerve cells, about the same as the number of trees in the Amazon rainforest. By comparison, in 2010, there were only about 5 billion mobile phones in the entire world. Each nerve cell can be connected to up to 10,000 others, so at any moment, the brain's neurons are communicating across 100 trillion connections by way of fizzing electrochemical reactions. The brain controls all our body's functions, including digestion, respiration, and reproduction. We can focus our attention on any task we want to, while our brains silently undertake countless other duties. How the mind emerges from the brain's breathtaking complexity remains a complete mystery. What one philosopher in the 17th century disparagingly referred to as a bowl of curds is now considered to be the most elaborate object in the known universe. The story of how we embarked on the mission to uncover its secrets is the subject of this series. In 1865, in Peru, an American cultural attaché called Ephraim George Squire was given a strange skull. A small square hole had been cut into its frontal bone, just above the right eye socket, apparently with the use of a sharp instrument. The skull was known to have come from an ancient Inca burial ground. But who had made the hole, and why? Squire took the skull to Paris to show to the world's leading authority on the brain, Paul Broca. Broca concluded that the owner of the skull had been subjected to a procedure known as trepanation. Today, Broca is remembered for locating the region of the brain that controls speech. But he wrote more on trepanation than he did on the localization of language. Operations to remove a small piece of bone from the skull, normally undertaken to relieve the pressure caused by the buildup of fluid, have been performed by surgeons for hundreds of years. In the 10th century, for example, a trepan cured the Prince Bishop of Cologne's intolerable headaches and saved his life. The hole allowed stinking pus that had built up following an ear infection to drain out from his skull. Peter Bruegel the Elder's 1568 painting, Cutting Out the Stone of Madness, depicts an unruly asylum where patients are subjected to rather chaotic trepanning procedures. It's around this time that the introduction of brace drills and circular bits made it easier to penetrate the hard bone of the skull. By the 17th century, a trepanation kit was an essential piece of equipment for British Navy surgeons. Broca pointed out that there were no unusual cracks anywhere on Squire's skull that would indicate injury. So he reasoned that the operation had been performed on a skull undamaged by any weapon or accident.
To trepan on an apparent fracture at the bottom of a wound is a sufficiently simple conception and does not necessitate the existence of advanced surgical arts. But here, the trepanning was performed on a point where there was no fracture, and probably not even a wound, so that the surgical act was preceded by a diagnosis. Whether this diagnosis was correct, as is probable, or false, we are in either case authorized to conclude that there was, in Peru, before the European era, a surgery already very advanced.
Broca was an admirer of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, which had only recently hinted that modern humans had ancient origins. So the hypothesis that prehistoric peoples apparently practiced brain surgery was fashionably provocative. Before long, perforated skulls were being discovered across Europe, from Scotland to Italy, from Portugal to Russia. In 1884, an archaeological dig in France uncovered numerous prehistoric skulls containing rather large 10-centimetre holes. Their owners had apparently survived for years following their ordeal, and many, like the Squire skull, also showed no signs of injury. Since then, thousands of trepan skulls have been found across the world. The earliest, from the Ukraine and Iraq, are around 10,000 years old.
The brain is enclosed in the cranium, made up of 8 bones, all connected with interlocking joints, called sutures. During the stresses of birth, the fontanelles, 4 large fibrous soft spots between the cranial bones, allow the infant's head to be distorted. As the child develops, the sutures fuse, and the fontanelles close over. Directly beneath the cranium are 3 membranes that protect the brain and spinal cord. They're called the meninges.
Archaeological evidence suggests 4 basic techniques were used to create the hole in the head. Some skulls show 4 straight cuts at right angles, noughts and crosses style, to remove a piece of bone. Some had been scraped with a rough stone until the meninges were exposed. Others were grooved with a sharp stone to carve a circular piece of bone out of the skull. And finally, there are some where a circle of holes was drilled with a sharp object, and then the space between the holes was cut to allow for the removal of a disc of bone. With estimated survival rates of up to 90%, those ancient surgeons must have been incredibly skilled to avoid penetrating the meninges once they'd breached the cranium. Although the brain itself can't feel any pain, these procedures must have been terrifying for the patient. Perhaps chewing coca leaves or drinking wine or beer brought about a state of anesthesia before the operation. Some key questions remain. Was the purpose of trepanation simply to treat head injuries by removing bits of broken skull bone? Or was the aim to release evil spirits imprisoned in the cranium? A pounding headache may have been attributed to spirit possession, even if the ultimate cause was probably a blood clot. Either way, trepanning would have helped. One society that didn't practice trepanation was that of ancient Egypt. Hundreds of thousands of items have been excavated from the lands of the pharaohs, but only a single skull, with what might be a trepan hole, has ever been discovered. The Egyptians knew that the brain was involved with bodily functions. Principally, they believed, in producing mucus for the nose. But they were wary of creating opportunities for evil spirits to enter the body through holes in the head. After death, in the process of mummification, the Egyptians removed the lungs, liver, intestines and stomach and stored them in special jars. But because the heart was believed to record a person's deeds, it was too important to be removed from the body. The brain, on the other hand, was dug out with an iron hook through the hole in the base of the skull, and then simply thrown away. Though important in life, the brain simply didn't feature in the Egyptian afterlife. In 1930, an ancient papyrus scroll that had been discovered in Egypt nearly 70 years earlier was finally translated. Known as the Secret Book of the Physician, the 4.5-metre scroll is one of the oldest medical texts in the world. It may originally have been written nearly 3,000 years before Christ by Imhotep, a surgeon who treated battle wounds. Imhotep recognized that damage to the brain can paralyze limbs on opposite sides of the body and cause problems in hand-eye coordination. Written in joined-up hieroglyphic script, the front side of the papyrus offered advice on how to treat various types of head injuries, while the reverse described medicines and magic spells, including one for making an old man youthful again. The 6th case on the scroll, advice on treating a head wound
with a skull fracture, exposing the brain,
contains the earliest known reference to the brain in any literature in the world, and it reveals that Egyptian physicians knew a lot about the organ in their heads. They apparently knew about the infant's fontanelle and the fact that damage to the meninges often led to infection and death.
If you treat a man for a gaping wound in his head, which has penetrated to the bone, fractured his skull, and exposed the marrow of his skull, you have to probe that wound. Should you find that fracture that is in his skull, like those ripples that happen in copper through smelting, with a thing in it that throbs and flutters under your fingers, like the weak spot of the crown of a boy before it becomes whole for him, that throbbing and fluttering happens under your fingers, since the marrow of his skull has become exposed, while he bleeds from his nostrils and suffers stiffness in his neck, an ailment for which nothing is done.
Those ripples that happen in copper through smelting is a reference to the elaborate convolutions of the cerebral cortex. Across the centuries, we can glimpse the brain, described here for the first time in human history. It seems to me all human societies have understood the brain in their own unique ways. In 1823, the Danish writer of fairy tales Hans Christian Andersen witnessed
a pitiful poor person made to drink by his superstitious parents a cup of the blood of an executed person.
In 1896, the folklorist Mabel Peacock documented how Lincolnshire peasants sometimes sought out a piece of the hangman's rope. And in 1908, a German newspaper reported that on the day of an execution, an old woman pushed her way through the crowds to request a small amount of the condemned man's blood for a young relative. In all three cases, they were seeking a cure for epilepsy. As with so many magical medical beliefs, that of drinking the blood of an executed criminal to cure epilepsy can be traced all the way back to ancient Greece. But we in the West are particularly indebted to Greek intellectual ideas. When we talk about the brain, mind and soul today, or cognition, emotion and the will, or even id, ego and superego, we're using concepts first articulated by the ancient Greeks. We've inherited many of their insights, and some of their puzzles.
The cerebrum, which is the Latin word for brain, is divided into symmetrical left and right cerebral hemispheres by a deep groove called the medial longitudinal fissure. The thin sheet of neural tissue that covers the cerebrum is called the cerebral cortex. This so-called grey matter plays a fundamental role in consciousness. At the back of the brain, tucked under the cerebral hemispheres, lies the cerebellum. The cerebellum, which means little brain in Latin, is responsible for balance, posture, and movement.
Our understanding of the brain emerged from classical Greek scholarship. Deities, diseases and dissections all contributed to ideas about the brain that now seem remarkably contemporary. It was the ancient Greeks who first assembled the building blocks of the modern psychological self. Consider, for example, the following claim.
Men ought to know that from nothing else but the brain come joys, delights, laughter and sports, and sorrows, griefs, despondency, and lamentations. And by this, in an especial manner, we acquire wisdom and knowledge, and see and hear and know what are foul and what are fair, what are bad and what are good, what are sweet and what are unsavory. And by the same organ, we become mad and delirious, and fears and terrors assail us.
Few would disagree with this today. It was written around 2,400 years ago by the Greek philosopher and physician Hippocrates. Greek philosophy began with the basic categories of experience: the weather, things that are cold and hot, things that are dry and wet, earth, air, fire and water. Eventually these concepts became formalized as the humoral theory of medicine, the belief that health depended on a balance of black bile, yellow bile, blood and phlegm. So it was first suggested that thoughts came from the air or from the blood. As for the soul, some philosophers placed it in the chest or between the eyebrows. Others thought it resided in the membranes immediately below the skull. So in other words, did the soul live in the heart or in the brain? Hippocrates considered the brain to be the chief organ of control.
Wherefore the heart and the diaphragm are particularly sensitive. They have nothing to do, however, with the operations of the understanding. But of all these, the brain is the cause.
Hippocrates' knowledge of the brain is recorded in his book On Injuries of the Head. He understood that the two hemispheres of the brain were divided by a thick membrane, and that wounds to one side of the head could cause convulsions on the opposite side of the body. Serious head injuries that didn't break the skull should be drilled or trepanned to release humours. An accumulation of black bile was especially dangerous, as it could lead to what the ancients called apoplexy, or what we now call stroke. Credited with being the first person to argue that diseases had natural causes, rather than resulting from the whims of gods, Hippocrates is known today as the father of medicine. But it was a serious neurological disorder, an enigmatic condition the ancients called the sacred disease, that brought about a revolution in the understanding of the brain. That disease was epilepsy. Before Hippocrates, mysticism and superstition surrounded epilepsy. Different deities were linked with different symptoms. Hippocrates ridiculed explanations that blamed the gods, and he mocked the quacks who profited from those suffering from the sacred disease.
It appears to me to be nowise more divine nor more sacred than other diseases, but has a natural cause from which it originates, like other affections. Men regard its nature and cause as divine from ignorance and wonder, because it is not at all like to other diseases. They who first referred this malady to the gods appear to me to have been just such persons as the conjurers and charlatans now are.
To explain epilepsy, Hippocrates invoked natural causes instead. He asserted that
this disease is found in phlegmatics and not in cholerics.
And he suggested that winds could make a person's brain wet and inundated with phlegm.
If you will cut open the head, you will find the brain humid, full of sweat, and having a bad smell. And in this way, truly, you may see that it is not a god that injures the body, but disease.
Around the same time, the Greek philosopher Plato asserted the primacy of the brain because he thought that society should be ruled by intellectuals, or philosopher kings. He argued that humans had three souls: logos, responsible for reason; theiomos, for emotion; and eros, desire. He associated each of the three souls with a different social class: reason with the governors of the state, emotion with the soldiers, desire with the proletariat. The brain has always been a political as well as a biological object. Plato's student, Aristotle, was a philosopher whose thinking was founded on biology. Aristotle argued that the heart must control the body because it moved, it was centrally located, and because it was the first organ to develop in the embryo. Although he placed the source of all human action in the heart, not the brain, Aristotle made the important distinction between the convoluted cerebrum and the striated little brain, or cerebellum, located at the back of the head. Human dissection was prohibited because the Greeks believed the soul wandered the banks of the Styx until the body was buried. Most ancient neurological knowledge therefore came from the study of ox brains. Systematic human dissection began in Alexandria, in Egypt, one of the most important centres of scholarship in the ancient world. By the 2nd century AD, medicine had become a craft based on dissection, observation, and experimentation. When he was in his early 20s, the man who was to become the greatest physician of the ancient world spent 4 years learning medicine in Alexandria. His name was Galen. Galen took every opportunity to examine human cadavers: a corpse found after a flood, a robber murdered in the woods. He cut open mice, cats, dogs, wolves and weasels, as well as lions, camels and bears. The Barbary ape was his favourite subject for dissection, but fish, birds and reptiles also fell under his knife. He even performed gruesome live experiments on horses, sheep, and most famously on a pig. Galen made a small incision in the pig's neck, which instantly silenced its squealing, although it didn't stop it thrashing around. Here was one of the earliest demonstrations that the brain controls action. The nerve that travels from the brain to the voice box, the laryngeal, is now known as Galen's nerve in his honour. In 157 AD, Galen was appointed physician to the great gladiatorial school in Pergamon. He later boasted, somewhat improbably,
"None of the patients under my care died, even though each suffered grave and multiple wounds."
Because the final convulsions of a dying gladiator resembled the movements of a patient struck by an epileptic seizure, and because blood was one of the 4 humours, Galen prescribed the drinking of the blood of a slain gladiator as a cure for epilepsy. Like Hippocrates, Galen considered the brain to be the ruling organ of the body, responsible for sensation and movement. He argued that since the heart has ventricles, by analogy, the brain's ventricles, small fluid-filled hollows that reside in the centre of the brain, must play a similar role in the operations of the soul. The faculties of apprehension, perception and reasoning must occur in the brain's ventricles. I think we can almost see the beginnings of the modern self here. In 1506, not long after starting to paint the Mona Lisa, Leonardo da Vinci embarked on a series of drawings of the human body. The hospital in Florence had granted him access to human corpses to dissect, but he had a problem. Biological specimens quickly putrefied in an age before preservatives, so they soon lost their structure and consistency. To draw even a single muscle required dexterity and speed, not to mention a ready supply of body parts. The soft tissues of the brain were particularly vulnerable. To overcome this difficulty, Leonardo used his knowledge as a sculptor to render the brain's internal shape in 3 dimensions. Deep within the brain lie the fluid-filled cavities called the ventricles. Leonardo made a cast of them.
Make 2 vent holes in the horns of the greater ventricles, and insert melted wax with a syringe, making a hole in the ventricle of memory, and through such a hole fill the 3 ventricles of the brain. Then, when the wax has set, take apart the brain, and you will see the shape of the ventricles exactly.
Leonardo attributed a mental faculty to each of the 3 ventricles: sensation, cognition, and memory. In this, he followed medieval convention, unusual for a man who generally resisted tradition. The battle for knowledge during the Renaissance wasn't so much between the anatomist and the artist, as between those who accepted ancient wisdom and those who challenged it. This was just as true for those scholars who wanted to understand the structure and functions of the brain.
At the centre of the brain are 4 interconnected cavities called ventricles. Filled with a clear liquid called cerebrospinal fluid, the ventricles occupy about 2% of the brain's total volume. Each hemisphere of the brain houses a lateral ventricle, which is shaped like a chicken's wishbone lying on its side. Both of these lateral ventricles are attached to a smaller third ventricle, which sits between them. The third ventricle is then connected by a small passageway known as the cerebral aqueduct to a fourth, which lies below it. Cerebrospinal fluid produced in the ventricles surrounds and cushions the cerebral cortex, the cerebellum, and the brainstem and spinal cord. Cerebrospinal fluid protects the brain and spinal cord by providing buoyancy and chemical stability.
1300 years before Leonardo, the most famous physician in the Roman Empire, Galen, had argued that the ventricle's role was to produce a fluid called animal spirits, which made thinking possible. 2 centuries later, early Christian scholars adopted the Greek belief that the human soul was located in the ventricles, though St. Augustine argued that the brain was too earthy a substance to host an ethereal soul. They also claimed there were 3 ventricles in the brain, not 4. A brain with 3 ventricles was more in keeping with the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. In the 4th century, Poseidonius suggested that injury to different areas of the brain affected different mental functions. Damage to the front part impaired imagination, while reasoning was affected by damage to the middle. Lesions at the back of the brain disturbed memory. But then scholarship on the brain stalled in Europe as the Dark Ages descended and the light of learning shone elsewhere. From the 8th century, a golden age of science dawned over Islam. Scholars translated the works of Hippocrates and Galen into Arabic and added their own discoveries about the brain. A major hospital was established in Baghdad in 982. Its director was Al-Razi, the leading scholar of the early Islamic world. He distinguished measles from smallpox, investigated psychosomatic conditions, and wrote a 30-volume encyclopedia of medicine. He also described the strange symptoms of apoplexy, what we now call stroke.
If somebody sinks to the ground, as having been overcome by a deep fatigue, and snores without sleeping normally, and when he is pricked with a needle doesn't feel it, then we can be sure that he suffers from apoplexy.
The most influential Islamic contributions to knowledge of the brain centered on this puzzling condition. Whereas one form of apoplexy didn't impair speech, another form certainly did, and it also paralyzed one side of the body. Illness was thought to come from an imbalance of the four bodily humours: yellow bile, black bile, blood and phlegm. And because apoplexy was blamed on the build-up of sticky black bile blocking the ventricles, treatment was based on scorching the head with a heated metal rod. One of the most important figures in Islamic medicine at this time was Ibn Sina. 20 years old in the year 1000, this prince of physicians wrote 100 books, including the standard reference text, the Canon of Medicine. Ibn Sina distinguished meningitis from other neurological conditions. He proposed that thoughts travel through the brain in a predictable sequence, starting with the front ventricle and moving on to the one at the back of the brain. His system, which shared elements of Poseidonus's earlier thinking, worked like this. Imprints from the eyes, ears, and the other senses were first combined into a unified whole in the front ventricle. This was called the sensus communis, the common sense. Impressions from the common sense were then transferred to the middle ventricle to be judged. This was the cogitative faculty, which established that wolves are dangerous and that children should be loved. Finally, judgments made in the middle ventricle passed to the rear ventricle for storage in memory. An 11th century manuscript describes the brain's chief faculties as imagination, intellect, and memory. In the accompanying drawing, the earliest known Western illustration of brain function, the liver, heart, testes and brain are housed in the quadrants of a circle which looks like a Celtic stone cross. The sutures, the joints between the skull's bones, are drawn as crude double lines. In line with the humoral theory of medicine, the manuscript describes the brain as being cold and moist, the heart hot and dry. An imbalance of humours was blamed for the Black Death of the 14th century, which killed a quarter of the population of Europe. The prohibition on human autopsies was abandoned in a desperate attempt to understand this deadly disease. Dead bodies were now vital sources of knowledge, and for the first time in 1,000 years, brains could be dissected again. The first treatise of anatomy based on the dissected brain was written at the University of Bologna in 1316. Some 30 years later, the earliest anatomical drawing of the brain's convoluted cortex was made by Guido da Vigevano. Leonardo da Vinci's mission to understand the brain had begun in Milan in 1487 with his book On the Human Figure. In his famous cross-sectional drawing of a copulating couple, a thin tube links the man's penis directly to his brain. Leonardo's caption reads,
"I display to men the origin of their cause of existence."
The sketch illustrated Ibn Sina's theory that semen transmits the soul from the brain to the fetus via the spinal cord. Valuing vision above all the other senses, Leonardo referred to the eye as the window to the soul. To draw was to understand.
Dispel from your mind the thought that an understanding of the human body, in every aspect of its structure, can be given in words. For the more thoroughly you describe, the more you will confuse the mind of the reader, and the more you will prevent him from a knowledge of the thing described. It is therefore necessary to draw as well as describe. I advise you not to trouble with words, unless you are speaking to a blind man.
In drawing the interior structures of the body and brain, Leonardo liberated himself from the dogma of the ancient Greeks. By demonstrating experimentally that a frog without a heart could briefly survive, but one with a severed spine could not, he cut straight through the Aristotelian faith in the primacy of the heart over the brain. Leonardo's sketches of the central nervous system date from around the time Michelangelo and Raphael were commissioned to produce fresco paintings for the Vatican. These artists all dissected corpses to expand their knowledge of human anatomy. Modern neuroscientists have provocatively suggested that Michelangelo and Raphael disguised references to the dissected brain within their paintings, in homage to the anatomical wisdom that was now guiding the quest for knowledge. Michelangelo's creation of Adam in the Sistine Chapel, for example, depicts God, angels and cherubs against a billowing red cape. The overall shape really does look like a human brain sliced down the middle. A cherub's right thigh becomes the optic nerve, while its leg forms the outline of the pituitary gland. A flowing green robe corresponds to the vertebral artery, and an angel's leg serves as the spinal cord. In the process of creating Adam, God is bestowing upon him the gift of intellect, as symbolized by the brain. It's certainly true that Renaissance artists studied anatomy obsessively, aiming for ever greater realism. Art and medicine were united in the search for knowledge. Painters and physicians bought pigments and pills from the same merchants. But now, on the eve of the scientific revolution, like the brain and the soul, science and art were to go their separate ways. In 1543, the same year that Copernicus scandalously suggested the Earth moved round the sun, Andreas Vesalius of Padua rejected another tenet of ancient wisdom. The role of the ventricles had dominated thinking about the brain since Galen's time. Vesalius, the greatest of the Renaissance anatomists, pointed out that many animals had ventricles anatomically similar to those of humans. It would obviously be absurd to accord them a soul. This was surely reserved for God's most noble creation. So Christian and Muslim theologians were both wrong. The soul did not reside in the ventricles. What then was the function of these fluid-filled spaces? Having decided the ventricles were of little consequence, Vesalius admitted that he now didn't have the slightest idea how the brain worked.
I can in some degree follow the brain's functions in dissections of living animals, with sufficient probability and truth. But I am unable to understand how the brain can perform its office of imagining, meditating, thinking, and remembering, or following various doctrines, however you may wish to divide or enumerate the powers of the reigning soul.
With the precision of a dissector's eye, Vesalius was hinting that the brain's functions were entirely separate from the workings of the soul. The brain was unequivocally the sovereign organ of the body. The modern self had been conceived. Anne Green was hanged at Oxford Castle on Saturday, December the 14th, 1650. The 22-year-old servant maid, described by a witness as
fat and fleshy, of an eye sanguine complexion,
had been found guilty of infanticide. Local bylaws stipulated that the body of any person executed within 21 miles of Oxford belonged to the university's reader in anatomy. But when the coffin was opened in front of a crowd of onlookers, including some of her friends and relatives, Anne was found to be not quite dead. Hot and cordial spirits were quickly administered. She was rubbed down and tickled with a feather. The physicians drained her of a cupful of blood and then put her to bed with a warm woman. Anne Green made a full recovery. She was subsequently pardoned and went on to marry, have 3 children, and live for another 15 years. A contemporary ballad celebrated her unlikely story.
Anne Green was a slippery queen. In vain did the jury detect her. She cheated Jack Ketch, and then the vile wretch escaped the knife of the learned dissector.
Jack Ketch was a notoriously inept executioner. The learned dissector, however, would go on to become one of the most important scientists in the history of the brain. His name was Thomas Willis.
The cerebral arterial circle, or circle of Willis, is a circuit of arteries that supply blood to the brain. If one of the arteries becomes blocked or narrowed, blood from the other vessels in the circle can preserve the brain's blood supply. Reddish-grey in colour, the pineal gland is about the size and shape of a pine nut, after which it is named. It is located near the centre of the brain, between the 2 cerebral hemispheres. The pineal gland secretes melatonin, a hormone that responds to seasonal light levels and regulates sleeping patterns.
By the time he was writing up his notes on the Anne Green case, Thomas Willis would have known that the French philosopher René Descartes was dead. He died in Sweden earlier that year. When customs officials opened the casket on the French border, they found the skull was missing. The man who in life had argued that mind and brain were two separate entities had in death suffered the indignity of having his head separated from his body. Descartes might have appreciated the irony. According to him, the body was little more than a machine, not unlike the hydraulically operated statues he'd once admired in the royal gardens of Paris. He'd argued that whereas the corporeal soul was material, and therefore perished with the body, the rational soul was immaterial, and therefore immortal. But how could an ethereal soul influence an earthly body if the two entities were fundamentally different kinds of things? This mind-brain dualism would trouble generations of philosophers in the coming centuries, as would Descartes' famous cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Descartes himself, a keen anatomist, had hoped that the answer to his apparently contradictory problem lay somewhere in the brain. In the course of his dissections, Descartes stumbled upon the tiny pineal gland, located close to the brain's fluid-filled ventricles, which he argued played a key role in the production of thoughts and actions. The pineal gland was perfectly placed to act as the soul's conduit to the body. It was sufficiently delicate to be moved by an immaterial soul. Its position also accounted for why people were prone to mood swings. Buffeted by animal spirits, gentle winds that inflate the ventricles just like the sails of a ship, the rocking motions of the little gland were experienced as conflicting passions. The size of a grain of rice, it was a curiously slender structure on which to build an entire philosophical edifice, especially one designed to explain the workings of the human brain. Some anatomists pointed out that older people whose pineal gland had calcified were usually of perfectly sound mind. And Vesalius, 100 years earlier, had noted that a sheep's pineal gland was larger than a human's. Thomas Willis agreed, and rejected Descartes' claim on the pineal gland.
Because animals, which seem to be almost quite destitute of imagination, memory, and other superior powers of the soul, have this glandular or kernel large and fair enough.
Brought up on a farm, Willis was an expert anatomist. When he was 16, Willis had enrolled at Oxford University as a servitor, the lowest class of student. While he was studying medicine, the English Civil War raged around him, and parliamentarians besieged Oxford 3 times. A staunch royalist, Willis volunteered for the King's Army, eventually becoming one of Charles I's personal physicians. He became extremely well connected. Among his friends, Willis counted the chemistry pioneer Robert Boyle and the man who would become the architect of St. Paul's Cathedral, Christopher Wren. These self-styled virtuosi intellectuals would go on to form the nucleus of the Royal Society of London. Willis eventually built up a large and lucrative medical practice, first in Oxford, then in London. Although one of his prescriptions involved donkey's milk and a roasted apple stuffed with frankincense, he readily abandoned traditional beliefs if the evidence required it. For instance, because hysteria was occasionally encountered in men, Willis reasoned that the most popular theory of the time, a restless uterus, might need to be revised. And, he added wryly, compared with women, men were more likely to succumb to hypochondria, a disease brought about by the spleen's nervous connections to the brain. Willis's Anatomy of the Brain and Nerves of 1664 was a groundbreaking attempt to correlate brain anatomy with mental function.
Within the womb of the brain, all the conceptions, ideas, forces, and powers whatsoever, both of the rational and sensitive soul, are formed.
He argued that people rub their foreheads when trying to remember a fact in order to
stir up or awaken the spirits dwelling in that place, as if endeavouring to find out something lurking there.
The cerebrum, the grey matter that we think of as the brain, must therefore be the location of memory. His model of brain function was based on a hierarchy.
Imagination, memory, discourse, and other more superior acts
were performed in the cerebrum at the top of the brain. From there, instructions descended to the cerebellum at the back. This then supplied animal spirits, in order to manage lowly involuntary actions such as breathing and digestion. According to Willis, The brain was a kingdom,
the
chapel
chapel of the deity,
and the sovereign organ of the body. Nerves were
companies of soldiers
acting on orders to move muscles like
the explosion of gunpowder.
At a time when the world was turned upside down, Willis saw the brain as an analogy of the divine right of kings to govern. Having ascended from humble stock to become one of the wealthiest physicians in the country, Willis believed that a harmonious society required cooperation between the different social orders. But if Willis saw the brain as the king's palace, then the soul was the shadowy lady who resided there. It was she who managed the household of the brain, discreetly governing its many activities.
There yet remains, after we have viewed not only the outward courts and porches of this fabric, as it were of a certain kingly palace, but also its intimate recesses and private chambers, that we next inquire into. What the lady or inhabitant of this princely place may be, in what part does she chiefly reside, and by what rule and government she disposes and orders her family.
Willis added that it was important to notice
what injuries of changes or diseases afflict this building or house of the brain.
One case study illustrates Willis's innovative approach to illness. He was puzzled by the case of a man who had died of a brain tumour, yet in life had presented no neurological symptoms.
It seemed remarkable that this person had not died previously of an apoplexy, which indeed he was so far from that he enjoyed to the last moments of this life the free exercise of his mental and bodily functions.
At autopsy, however, Willis made a momentous discovery. Dissecting the brain from below, itself a novel technique, Willis found that the tumour had indeed blocked one of the main cerebral arteries. But an adjacent artery, enlarged to 3 times its usual size, had evidently compensated for the loss, enabling the patient's brain to acquire an adequate supply of vital liquor. Christopher Wren's beautiful drawing of the intricate arterial structures made their existence appear obvious. Yet no one before Willis had correctly described the cerebral arterial circle, or what is now known as the Circle of Willis. Thomas Willis is considered by many to be the father of neuroscience. Yet at the time, it was far from universally accepted that sullying one's hands with putrefying brains would lead to great discoveries. The Cambridge philosopher Henry Moore scoffed at what he considered to be a foolish and futile venture.
Verily, if we take a right view of this lax pith or marrow in man's head, neither our sense nor understanding can discover anything more in this substance that can pretend to such noble operations as free imagination and the sagacious collections of reason than we can discern in a cake of suet or a bowl of curds. For this loose pulp that is thus wrapped up within our cranium is but a spongy and porous body. I demand in what knot, loop, or interval thereof does this faculty of free fancy and active reason reside?
Other authorities were more optimistic about what future explorations into this bowl of curds might reveal. The Danish anatomist Nicolaus Steno praised Willis for being
the author of a very singular hypothesis. He houses common sense in the corpora striata, the imagination in the corpus callosum, and the memory in the cortical substance.
But he added a note of caution.
How can he be so sure that these 3 operations are performed in the 3 bodies which he pitches upon?
The fact was, no one was sure. But by linking case studies with anatomical studies of the brain, Willis and his contemporaries had made a start. Henry Moore's brainless proclamation would soon seem utterly ridiculous. One day in the summer of 1776, the Member of Parliament for Worcestershire made a startling discovery. For the past 4 years, John Walsh had been trying to work out how certain types of fish inflicted a brief but agonizing paralysis on anyone unfortunate enough to touch one. Walsh now turned his attention to a large black eel that had recently been brought over to London from South America. Crowded into his London residence that day were over 40 expectant fellows of the Royal Society. Walsh took the squirming eel from its tank dried it off, and laid it on top of a tin plate. What happened next was the proof he'd been looking for. A tiny blue flash of light. The spark proved, once and for all, that fish could indeed generate electricity. And if electricity powered animal nervous systems, then perhaps human consciousness also had something to do with sparks fizzing deep within the brain. Walsh had been corresponding about the strange properties of electric fish with one of the world's leading authorities on electricity, Benjamin Franklin. But on the very day, August the 2nd, that Walsh was coaxing sparks out of his electrical eel, Franklin was tending to more pressing matters on the other side of the Atlantic. He was signing the American Declaration of Independence. Apart from the coincidence of the date, the key to what connected a small flash of light in a darkened room with the self-evident truth that all men are created equal lay deep within the brain.
The brain is composed of grey matter, located on the surface of the cerebral cortex, and white matter, which is found deeper inside. White matter is made up of bundles of threads, called axons, which conduct nerve impulses away from each nerve cell towards the next. Axons are covered in an insulating fatty layer, called a myelin sheath, which speeds up the nerve impulse. The largest white matter structure in the brain is the corpus callosum, a wide, flat bundle of nerve fibres beneath the cortex that connects the brain's two cerebral hemispheres.
In his Anatomy of the Brain and Nerves of 1664, Thomas Willis followed ancient doctrine in proposing that the brain was powered by animal spirits, gentle winds distilled from the blood. From the grey matter of the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum, animal spirits drifted down through the pipes of the white matter before being circulated to the rest of the body and the muscles. Willis was
astonished at the innumerable arrangements of nerve fibres distributed in wonderful order into the different parts of the entire body.
His Danish colleague Nicolaus Stierno was also enamoured with the intricate beauty of the many tracts, cords and pathways that ran from the cerebral cortex to the middle of the brain.
To say that the white matter is but a uniform substance, like wax, in which there is no hidden contrivance, would be too low an opinion of nature's finest masterpiece. You must admit that these fibers have been arranged with great skill, since all the diversity of our sensation and our movements depends upon this. We admire the skillful construction of the fibers in each muscle. How much more, then, ought we to admire it in the brain, where each of these fibers, confined in a small space, functions without confusion and without disorder?
For the generation of scholars who followed Willis, order was created by efficient communications. From the 18th century printing press came a torrent of information in the form of newspapers, journals, encyclopedias, and dictionaries. The Age of Reason was fueled by the dissemination of knowledge across all levels of society. Many 18th century anatomists rejected Willis's analogy of the brain acting like a king, issuing commands from on high. Nor did they like the idea that the brain housed a fixed set of mental faculties, such as memory, in specific regions. Instead, what mattered to Enlightenment minds was the equal distribution of functions throughout the brain, itself made possible by an intricate network of information channels. This egalitarian model of the brain was called the doctrine of equipotentiality. It implied that the white matter fibres were just as important to the functioning brain as its grey cerebral cortex. The largest mass of white matter was called the corpus callosum. Located in the middle of the brain, this thick bundle of fibres connects the two cerebral hemispheres. Neurology's fundamental challenge was to trace the pathways of the white matter fibres that were embedded in the brain like the roots of a plant. But how did messages travel through them? Hydraulic explanations based on the ancient doctrine of animal spirits no longer seemed plausible by the early 18th century. Experiments had shown that contracting muscles didn't get bigger, as you'd expect if animal spirits were the cause. And the recently invented microscope convinced many that nerves weren't filled with a vibrating ether, as Isaac Newton had suggested. So if nerves weren't hollow pipes filled with the gentle wind of animal spirits, how did the brain interact with the body? And how could the rapid speed of thought be explained? A plausible answer came from a surprising source. At the same time as this growing interest in the white matter of the brain, there was a widespread fascination with the properties and possibilities of electricity. Hand-cranked frictional generators and electric storage bottles, called Leyden jars, created sparks for use in amusing scientific demonstrations. In one of these, the spark made a 300-metre-long line of Carthusian monks, all holding hands, jump en masse. Electrified kisses set glasses of brandy on fire. And for the vast sum of 50 guineas a night, one medical quack offered an electrified celestial bed that promised to deliver to amorous couples not only the greatest sexual pleasure, but also the most beautiful and talented offspring. By the middle of the century, electricity was being promoted as a wonderful new cure for all sorts of disorders of the nervous system, from epilepsy to blindness, and the common paralytic disorder known today as stroke. John Wesley, the preacher and founder of Methodism, was one of the first to suggest that electricity could be used for medicinal purposes. Electrotherapy, he claimed, could cure precisely those conditions, deafness and lameness, that were frequently mentioned in the Bible. In 1759, a man who'd been struck with a palsy of the tongue was cured of his mutism thanks to a timely application of electricity. The best known and most respected electrical expert of the Enlightenment was Benjamin Franklin. At Christmas 1750, Franklin was about to kill a turkey with a charge from a Leyden jar when he electrocuted himself by mistake. The shock knocked him off his feet. Disturbed by having no memory of the blue flash of light, or the loud crack that accompanied it, Franklin later wondered
what the consequence would be if such a shock were taken through the head.
He went on to conduct experiments to find out whether applying electricity to the head could cure sensory losses caused by smallpox, hysterical epilepsy, and palsies resulting from strokes. Once it became known that the application of electricity through the head wasn't necessarily fatal, doctors tried using it to cure a range of diseases thought to originate in the brain. In 1792, a London physician called John Birch administered electricity to a man who'd become melancholy following the death of one of his children.
I covered his head with a flannel and rubbed the electric sparks all over the cranium. He seemed to feel it disagreeable, but said nothing. On the second visit, I passed 6 small shocks through the brain in different directions. As soon as he got into an adjoining room and saw his wife, he spoke to her, and in the evening was cheerful, expressing himself as if he thought he should soon go to his work again. I repeated the shocks in like manner on the 3rd and the 4th day, after which he went to work, and he remained perfectly well.
Experimental proof of the existence of what he called animal electricity was provided by the Italian physician Luigi Galvani in 1791. Galvani discovered that a severed frog's leg could be made to twitch when an electrical charge was connected to its spinal cord. Just touching the leg with a metallic conductor in the absence of electricity also made it twitch. Galvani's research raised some disturbing questions about the brain. If an animal's legs could move on their own without being connected to a brain, perhaps the brain retained sentience without being connected to its body. Galvani's nephew carried out some macabre investigations on decapitated criminals. The electrical impulses he applied to their severed heads were said to cause many different grimaces, including the quivering of the jaw, contortion of the facial muscles, and even the opening of the eyes. In 1817, a German scientist, Karl August Weinhold, claimed to have scooped out the grey matter from a kitten's skull and replaced it with a mixture of silver and zinc.
For almost 20 minutes, the animal got into such a live tension that it raised its head, opened its eyes, stared for a time, tried to get into a crawling position, sank down again several times, yet finally got up with obvious effort, hopped around, and then sank down exhausted. The heartbeat and the pulse, as well as the circulation, were quite active during these observations.
The gruesome experiment seemed to suggest that a cerebral cortex wasn't necessary to sustain vital functions. The year after Weinhold reported his findings, Mary Shelley published Frankenstein, a novel all about the creation of artificial life. Her protagonist, Victor Frankenstein, pronounced,
"With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet.
The spark that John Walsh had coaxed from an electric eel in 1776 had raised the possibility that the brain was powered by electricity, not animal spirits. In an age suspicious of inherited privilege and regal power, what mattered was not established structures of authority or predetermined functions, but rather the efficient circulation of knowledge. The Declaration of Independence, signed by Benjamin Franklin on the same day, argued for the severance of the United States from the authority of the British Crown on the basis of the equal station to which the laws of nature entitled all men to consider themselves created equal. Such egalitarian sentiments were reflected in the way the anatomy of the brain was understood during the Enlightenment. White matter fibres, those channels of communication that made consciousness possible, were seen as just as important as the grey matter of the cerebral cortex. As Samuel Johnson put it in 1778, society is held together
by communication and information.
It was a sentiment with which the brain anatomists wholeheartedly agreed.